on the global financial system. And so we're just really honored to have him tonight. Housekeeping, where he's going to give a few remarks. Then he and I are going to have a short conversation here in the chairs. And then we will open the floor to audience questions. Audience, if you should have some cards that will be passed out. And if you will write your question on that card, I will get to a few of those, probably with the time we have. That's probably going to be 3 to 5 questions, but I encourage you to get a card and write a question, and then that'll be brought up to me. I think that's it. Otherwise, we will just enjoy this time. We'll have a conversation. We'll learn a lot. And with that, I will call up President Malpass, and we look forward to hearing you speak.
Thank you very much, John. And hi, everybody, and thanks for coming out tonight. I want to really express my appreciation to the Baker Institute for Public Policy for welcoming me to Rice University. It's truly a privilege to be here at the Institute, shaped by Secretary James Baker. He was my former boss and mentor. As I near the end of my tenure as president of the World Bank on June 1st, it is fulfilling to give remarks this evening on international development, especially after meeting this morning with Secretary Baker, who led much of my early work on economics and finance and made so many contributions to world freedom. I worked for Secretary Baker at both the Treasury and State Departments from 1986 through 1993 as a Deputy Assistant Secretary. Working for an active cabinet secretary, I had the great good fortune to work on many topics that were critical then and are still relevant now. I won't go through the full list, but the debt limit was one of them, the crisis in developing countries, of course the IMF and the World Bank, but on down a broad list, and you can imagine how energetic Secretary Baker was and is. So many of the leadership techniques I use came from Secretary Baker, so I'd like to tell you a little about that. They won't be news, but they are well worth repeating. Hard work, prior preparation, attention to detail. Each one has a good story, but I'll save that for another time. Hard work, prior preparation, and since many current and future leaders are in the audience, let me mention one more of his management techniques: the importance of action-forcing events and individual initiative. These are particularly relevant in a world that seems adrift. I've just participated in 2 long sets of G7 meetings in Japan, first with the finance ministers in Niigata, then with leaders in Hiroshima over the last 3 days. Leaders are confronted with endless information and with consequential challenges, but the temptation of large organizations is to let things slide. To move the needle on global affairs, there must be someone taking action. Secretary Baker created movement by focusing on action-forcing events. He would require memos, meetings, and conversations to state at the outset what action was needed or possible. This had at least 2 benefits. First, it forced his hundreds of staff to refine the question and present options succinctly. And second, by forcing the organizations to think through an issue from the standpoint of action, more decisions could be made earlier. It encouraged people to take initiative. Looking back, I often wonder which period was more tumultuous, then or now. In my years of working for Secretary Baker, we confronted several problems similar to those today. Rapid increases in government spending and debt marked by very difficult political battles to increase the debt limit. Recall that Europe and Japan faced the same problem of unrestrained government growth. There was also the problem of a debt crisis that engulfed developing nations. Recall the severity of the Latin debt crisis we tackled in the 1980s and the current still to be resolved crisis in as many as 60 countries now at high risk of debt distress. Many of these are in Africa, which faces rapid population growth amid numerous other challenges. There were also the trade battles. They still divide us, but in the 1980s, Japan was the feared trade threat. It was forced into so-called voluntary restraints on exports in the U.S., on their exports to the U.S. In Hiroshima on Saturday, there was substantial discussion of the paralysis today at the World Trade Organization, the over-reliance on China, and the conflicts between subsidies, trade, and the ESG standards. Importantly, there was instability of currencies then, and there is now. It dominates the inflation and stock market outlook amid the fear that the dollar could lose out to foreign competitors. In those days, the Plaza and Louvre Accord, which were Secretary Baker initiatives, they addressed the fluctuations in the dollar, yen, and euro. I addressed similar currency problems directly in my work at the U.S. Treasury Department in 2017 through the G7 and G20 communique language on currency stability and in my congressional testimonies. So currency stability through 2021 contributed to stronger growth and investment. But we now face new challenges, including Bitcoin and expanded use of China's yuan. Secretary Baker and President Reagan took many consequential decisions to restore growth through spending, tax, and regulatory policy reforms and stabilization of the dollar. The doctrine of peace through strength defeated the Soviet Union, leaving it in collapse. Today's tumult might be even harder to solve. China is a markedly different challenge than the Soviet Union, something I know the Baker Institute has worked on extensively. China is controlled by single-party communism, as was the Soviet Union, but much of China's economy uses prices to allocate goods and services. China's engineers and scientists, many of them trained in the U.S., have highly advanced skills applicable to commerce. The Tiananmen Square disaster led to a decisive policy of currency stability. That's the opposite of the Soviet Union, which had no usable currency for 70 years. Today's fiscal and monetary stress is also fundamentally harder than in the 1980s. We thought it was hard then, but the national debts in the advanced economies have grown by an order of magnitude. In the US, we've gone from 50% debt to GDP to the projections of 200% debt to GDP, not counting the excessive debt of some state and local governments. And also, I'll mention the non-transparent public pension liabilities in some states. Governments in Japan and Europe also have huge debts. That's troubling because their populations are declining. This raises doubts about whether private sectors around the world can produce enough to carry these debt burdens. The central banks in advanced economies have helped delay the financial effects of the debt buildup through post-monetarism. That means borrowing from the private sector to buy trillions of dollars in government bonds. But this has severe anti-growth consequences in that global capital is being allocated away from small businesses and toward bond issuers. That means toward governments and big corporate bond issuers. Thus, while the 1980s were marked by accelerating growth in interest rates that could decline from a very high level, the current environment risks an extended period of dangerously low growth as an increasing portion of global capital flows to governments when interest rates rise to normal. The question of whether the tumult is worse than in the 1980s or ends as well as it did in the 1980s will take years to assess. All we can say with confidence is that today's problems are urgent, and the outcome depends on actions and individual initiative by leaders like Secretary Baker. Let me touch on 3 other topics and then close. First, for developing countries, the prospect of dangerously slow global growth and high debt burdens is creating sharp reversals in their development. This was discussed among G7 leaders and partners over the weekend in Hiroshima, but I'm discouraged by the lack of resolve or action on growth. Poorer countries face political and social pressure on their governments. There's consternation about inaction as China's soft power grows. And for some countries, there's rising hunger and violence. There's externally funded insurgencies. The second thing I wanted to mention is declining access to energy and electricity is one of the dominant challenges facing development. There was substantial discussion at the G7 meetings of the importance of allowing natural gas as a transition fuel, adding gas and nuclear power to stabilize electricity grids that have been weakened by intermittency of renewables, and also discussion of ways to harmonize ESG standards and carbon prices with the ultimate goal that I have laid out of creating infrastructure as an asset class that would be investable. And lastly, after serving more than 4 years as president of the World Bank Group, I believe the World Bank Group can help with each of these problems, but can't solve them. I'm proud to leave the World Bank financially sustainable and able to work quickly. But over the past 4 years, the World Bank Group has provided $440 billion in financing, from providing record financing to developing countries. Well, I won't share the list, but I'm proud of the accomplishments at the World Bank. So let me conclude with a cautionary point. We should be very aware of the severity of the crisis facing development. I've advocated a full rethinking of many core global policies, including the policies that are crowding out developing countries and their private sectors from energy, food, and capital, and that are deepening their fragility. So that's the concluding cautionary point. We have to be aware of the severity of this crisis and look for areas to take action. I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion with John. Thank you all.
So now we're just going to discuss most of the issues you just passed over.
We can do them all again.
But I want to start with, so you were the president of the World Bank in what could be considered the hardest period to ever be the president of the World Bank. You had to deal with overlapping crises that included COVID, a Russian invasion of Ukraine, historically high inflation throughout the world and in the U.S., food insecurity, a climate transition. I think that covers the most of them. And
the evacuation from Afghanistan.
The evacuation from Afghanistan. So this all happens. I guess I would like to get, and I think it's awesome that you started your career working for Secretary Baker, and we've come full circle.
Yeah.
And you're at his institute right after you've been the president of the World Bank and handled all of these issues. He was a problem solver. He obviously taught you how to be a problem solver. So can you tell us what you're most proud of in your career at the World Bank, and the problems that were the hardest that you solved, or the ones that you didn't solve?
Thanks. One thing I'm proud of is the clarity of the vision even through the crises. I came into the World Bank and said to people, what I want to do is have our programs cause good outcomes for people in developing countries. We're not working for the governments, we're working to have a better environment for people. And then the crises came, but the bank, people kept working hard because I think that vision or that idea fit very well within, that's why, within the World Bank. That's why people come to work there. And sometimes people lose focus, and so I was glad to be able to maintain that. So that was one good outcome. You know, there are several. We've created a strong initiative for private sector development within the bank. What I wanted to do was strengthen the way the World Bank interacts with, to encourage private sectors in developing countries. You might say, well, that seems obvious, and it is, except the bank is a little bit siloed. So the International Finance Corporation works with private companies, and the World Bank Group works with governments. Well, okay, let's put the two together much more closely. So we're working strongly to do that. That's going to help with all forms of development. How do you make an attractive climate where they hire people and get new investment? But that takes really, I hope, years of work by the bank in each country and region of the world. Because you can imagine, if only a developing country I could name, and your audience knows many of them, if only that country would do something that was attractive to the private sector, people would beat a path to their door. One other that I'll mention is the debt problem. So I started this a little bit at the Treasury, not a little bit. We had a major initiative at the U.S. Treasury starting in 2017 to recognize the size of the problem, that there was a huge amount of lending going on by China and by the private sector. That means Eurobond lending from investors in London and in New York. The huge amounts of lending going into developing countries without much in the way of guardrails on it. So my view is that sunshine, transparency are really important when you think about contracts. It's important to support contracts, but they should be disclosed. China had fallen into the habit, really starting in 2014, of having non-disclosure clauses in their contracts. Mm-hmm. Well, that should set off alarm bells a bit, and so we began that work and have continued it at the World Bank. I have to say, you know, I'm disappointed with the slowness of the process. We're working with a lot of countries. In fact, there are 60 countries that are categorized by the World Bank and the IMF as being over-indebted to the point of it being at risk of being unsustainable. So, you know, when that happens, you should start early and recognize it and then begin to take action on it. We obviously learned that in the Latin debt crisis, which Secretary Baker worked immensely on, and I tried to support in the 1980s. And so the world knows that this is a big problem and should be tackled early. It was discussed over the weekend, but you know, it's not accelerating. The solutions are not accelerating. I can give you a little story. As Secretary Baker left the Treasury Department in the summer of 1988 to help with the campaign, President Bush 41's campaign, Secretary Brady came into the Treasury Department, and the problem was still ongoing, and so we worked on a way to securitize the bank debt for Latin America, and that ultimately became the Brady Plan, which was helpful in resolving this major challenge. And so there needs to be dramatic steps now for the countries, but the process has gone very slowly.
So I want to get to the U.S. debt problem, but let's
speaking of slow problems.
Before we get there, since you mentioned the fragility of developing economies, and then we're talking about the crisis ongoing. What's going on with the African debt crisis and the countries there? I know at least one country's defaulted. What are the outlooks, and what's been the cause and the problems that have occurred?
And that gets into, so let's talk about Zambia, about Ghana, about Ethiopia. They've all asked for help from the world through the common framework. That's a G20 initiative. So G20 means the group of 20 countries, which, by the way, includes China and Russia and Argentina and some others. And so the idea is that group will help countries when they ask for assistance. The challenge is it goes very slowly. And so we were pleased over the last week that Ghana has formed a creditors committee, and China allowed that to happen. And so, but still, there needs to be concrete steps. You have to reach agreement. So what we're talking about is the need to lower the payments on the debt because the country can't maintain the payments. So, and there's no international bankruptcy process. If it were in the US, you would declare bankruptcy. There would be an appointed process, I don't even know how it works, by a judge who would get the creditors to show how much they feel they are owed. They'd reconcile the numbers, and then there would be a workout. That doesn't go on internationally. So each part of that has to be done individually, and that's happening on Zambia. So it's led by the G20 with support from the Paris Club in Paris, and with support from IMF, and the World Bank tries to help where we can. One role that the World Bank plays in those countries is to provide ongoing funding. For example, in Zambia, they've stopped paying their creditors, which helps on their cash flow, and the World Bank can then provide some funding to sustain them. But it's been going on now for 2.5 years, waiting to get debt relief from, in Zambia's case, from China and from some of the private sector creditors. So that gives you.
So what's so they owe, I mean, I've seen that China is like 14 or 15% of the debt, and then the private creditors are out there. I mean, are the private creditors more willing to accept bargains, or is there kind of a problem in that if one doesn't accept it, the other won't accept it?
There's a little bit of chicken or egg. So I won't accept something worse than what you accept. So there's a goal of having comparability of treatment. But on that statistic of the official credit, meaning, so the US government has ways to give loans to poor countries. And so that's official. That's US Export-Import Bank, the Commodity Credit Corporation, and others. Of that kind of credit worldwide, China is owed well over 60% of that, so more than the whole rest of the world combined. So that means there has to be a workout that includes China. And so they drag their feet, or they're looking for a process that works for them. They have multiple parts of the Chinese government that have made loans, and they don't really have a process internally to take losses. I was part of that in 1989. Dick Darman was head of OMB, and the US, it was only in 1989 that the US government put in a process to allow scoring on the budget when a debt was reduced. So if we think about that, China has some work to do to get to the starting point of this process. So I went in December to China along with Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, and we had dinner with the Chinese creditors and try to push them to make progress. I'm a little frustrated because in a way the world has to come down and say, now is the time to make progress. I'd say that to China, but also to the private sector creditors.
So you spoke about China being kind of the 1980s. In the 80s, we had to solve a problem with the Soviet Union. Now, the big problem seems to be China, or at least one of them. The pandemic kind of showed us, or what we learned from the pandemic is we can't rely on China for a lot of really important goods. And so there's this decoupling from China that needs to happen. What is the impact of that going to be on world economic growth, on U.S. economic growth, on China's growth? How does that affect the economic system if we go through this period of deglobalization after 3 decades of really increasing globalization?
I think we can recognize, and it was made even more clear by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that it's not a good idea to be overly dependent on one part of the world. The world allowed itself to become reliant on China for things like medical and chemical feeder stocks. China was really trying to expand, and sometimes using subsidies or state-owned enterprises to become very efficient. The economy of scale appealed to them. They are hugely populous, the most populous, but now they're the second largest economy in the world. So I think there has to be a realistic view. As I said in the remarks, it's a very different situation than the Soviet Union. It was artificial in many regards, and the primary one, they didn't have a currency ever. And so China has actual commercial activity very powerfully. So I think the practical way for the world is to think, look, we don't want to be dependent, over-reliant, and so there should be some diversification of markets. That's different than saying deglobalize. So there should be a hard look by U.S. companies in supply chains that are nearer to the U.S. That makes sense. I hope Mexico will step up and have a good, strong private sector that is dependable in the sense of providing goods. That's something the Secretary worked on hard in the 1980s, recognizing the importance of Mexico, and we worked on the NAFTA, the trade agreement that was important in enabling some of the products from there. That can be done in other parts of the world as well. So I think that's important, and it has to be viewed, I think, in the context that we want world markets to find the least cost supplier. And so from China's standpoint, there should be clear recognition that subsidies, if you subsidize in order to help a company become dominant, that is not appropriate within in the world. Now, other countries do that as well. One of the things the bank is doing, and we are coming out this week, working jointly with the WTO and the OECD on a website. Transparency is really important in all of this, that describes the subsidies of various parts of the world, because the dollar value of these has become gigantic. Governments are competing with each other to see who can give more subsidies for things, and that we know from economics is a really, it causes slow growth.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little and talk about subsidies, and specifically, so one of the big challenges we face in the world, I think the World Bank has been very active on, is climate change. And then recently, this past summer, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which included...
the U.S. did.
The U.S. did, which included what was a large amount of subsidies, which now turns out to be much larger than the scoring institutions in the U.S. currently envisioned. But that's created problems with some of our trading partners, because it's seen as subsidies that benefit the U.S. companies over foreign companies that operate within our territories. I guess talk about climate change and what are the solutions if every time, if we want, we want green energy, but when we subsidize it, then we have a trading partner problem. How do we get all these things, all the pegs to fit?
Well, a lot of work in order to get the pegs to fit. But let me say a word on subsidies and the scoring. I know you know a lot about scoring, and it's a challenge for within the government. If you're making up a budget and somebody comes with an idea, you're going to underprice it because that makes the idea more attractive. So this is a pattern problem. So you start with something and you say, oh, it won't cost much, and then you really see where it's going, and the price tag goes up and up each year. So that's a concern, and that has been raised. I mentioned I was in the G7 finance ministers meetings in Niigata a week and a half ago, and there was discussion of the problem that if the U.S. subsidizes, then other countries will want to subsidize in order to do counter subsidies. That has occurred. I mean, in the 1980s, it was subsidies by France that the U.S. matched with what was called the war chest. And so you get into a competing subsidies game, and all you get is a lot of expense. So there needs to be guardrails on that process. Now, coming more to the climate point, what I've argued at the World Bank as we prepared our climate change action plan in 2021 prior to Glasgow, the Glasgow COP26 summit. We really wanted to get across to the world the idea that whatever your goals are within the realm of climate, you need to really be focused on integrating those with development. You can't do them as a separate activity. They have to be part of a country's actual plan, and that there should be some effort to have the outcomes end up being maximized. The goal, it felt like the goal of the world was to say how much they wanted to pledge and how much they wanted to promise to spend, and not actually much focus on what they were actually trying to do. So where we stand now is, and World Bank has proposed the concept that there be verifiable, whatever your sustainable goal is, let's say you want an outcome, there should be some verification of that, and then that becomes interesting to investors. So I mentioned the idea of creating an asset class, and so this could be done on what's called global public goods. So if the world wants something done by the developing world, then let's name what that is, have some clear standards of what that is. For example, if you want countries to prepare for catastrophic events, and you recognize that if you do that, that's good for the world because there'll be less cost, less lives lost. Okay, then have some verification. That way you get away from greenwashing, because that's been one of the big challenges. So I spoke extensively in Hiroshima on the idea there needs to be some agreed standards, what it is you're trying to do. If that's greenhouse gas emission reduction, then say that, as opposed to saying that your goal is to spend a lot of money. So we need to get away from the idea of the conferences being the purpose, and to the point that you have standards, you have some verification of the results, and then if that can be done, you would standardize the contracts so that they can be, so that you can have a lot more of them. If you want 1,000 projects that are reducing the dependence on coal, then say that and have some kind of verifiable standard. The World Bank can, this is attractive within the World Bank because it can do each part of this kind of activity. My sense is, well, and there was substantial discussion over the last 2 weeks, that the standards that are being used for what you're trying to do are not agreed on within the global community. ASEAN, the Asian countries, have a different set of goals. I'll give you a practical result. Is your goal to stop fossil fuels, or is your goal to move toward less carbon-intensive fossil fuels? Well, there's a big difference in what you would do within your global investments. And the developing countries clearly are saying, look, our priorities are to have electricity access, we want to have clean water, and we need to have energy production that is robust enough. A big complaint in the developing countries is that their grids are becoming less and less dependable because of the intermittency of solar and wind. And so that's a non-trivial problem. So what we've done in our diagnostics in the World Bank is have people actually consider the dependability of the grid as they put together what countries can be doing in the climate field. Sorry to go on, but one thing I didn't mention is adaptation. So very important is as people think about climate, they worry about changes going on in their own climate. And that leads to a very robust area of economic development, which is not to live in floodplains, for example, but and identifying that within various countries. I met Saturday with the Prime Minister of Vietnam. So Vietnam has the Mekong River Delta, which probably for centuries has flooded, and yet people live in it. And so the World Bank is working with them in having a plan for preparedness so that if there is the risk of flooding, there's some way to have evacuation and some way to have safe spaces for people. And so to incorporate that within your urban planning and within your country development plans makes sense, costs a lot of money, and so there has to be a way to maximize the outcome and the results.
Very good. That's a lot of information.
Yeah.
So the pandemic had some major impacts in the U.S. Probably one of the most important was on education. What was the parallel in developing countries? How bad was the loss in human capital development over that period?
Severe, and it's troubling to development. So the World Bank keeps the global data on education of children, and so there's a standardized set of data, and it's transparent for at age 10. Children are tested, can they read a basic story in their native language? And that may be so in India, that means the native language, which there are hundreds of. And so the easiest spot, can you read a basic story? And that used to be 50% could not read it. And that number has gone to 70% worldwide. And in most of the poor countries, it's literally 90%. So at age 10, not reading a basic story. So we have a whole action plan on that, right. But it consists of, and very importantly, is that you identify that foundational skills are what you want to be taught within the schools, that the children be physically in school, because all of the data showed that if they were trying to do distance learning, it, as far as we can tell, didn't work really anywhere in the world. And then that there be the teachers be encouraged, and this is I think a challenge in the U.S. to teach to the level of the children, not to their age. Mm-hmm. So if you're a 12-year-old, but you can't read, then it's gonna be very frustrating for you to sit in school when the teacher acts as if you can read. And so have have the teachers be willing to teach to the level of the children. We announced that. I spoke at a big forum in New York, along with, it's very interesting, on this particular plan that I'm talking about, we got strong global consensus that included the United Nations, the US government spoke, the Secretary of Education spoke, all with the idea that you have to get the kids back in school, you have to teach to their level, and you have to teach foundational skills, which are all very important. And then also, of course, there was thrown in the idea there needs to be more funding, which is true.
I agree.
But other pandemic challenges, as we think about it, is the obvious importance of markets being able to interact. And then one thing we found very much within the COVID experience was the importance of countries choosing what was appropriate for them. There is a temptation to say, we know what's best for everybody and we're going to distribute it fairly. That proves very difficult, and that was demonstrated in COVID because different countries literally wanted different vaccines. They wanted different types of oxygen providers. And so if you tried to have a global program that was fair to everybody, it didn't match up. The reality is people want different things, and that's actually important to them. So you ended up with a lot of waste during COVID because the wrong things were sent, or countries were receiving goods from the global system that they hadn't asked for and didn't really want. So I think a challenge in pandemics or in global emergencies is recognizing that there has to be very much a partnership from the receiving end. You can imagine if people just send aid to Pakistan for their flooding, it may not be what the people of Pakistan really need. Their needs are different than elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, we really don't have enough time to cover all the questions. I'm only like halfway.
I'll be shorter.
I'm only halfway. No, you're doing a great job. So, I mean, we haven't talked Russia, the Russian war. We have not talked U.S. debt crisis and the debt ceiling. But I keep hearing about that in the news. Joe Biden at the G7 meeting saying he's optimistic we're going to reach an agreement. What would be the consequence if we didn't get an agreement? I guess I'm thinking both in terms of the U.S., but would it have an impact on developing countries? And then in general, because we're going to go to audience questions next, what's your view on the U.S. debt, the fact that CBO projects it to be 185% of GDP by 2052? Just speak on that issue.
Okay. I think a starting point is people should recognize there are intended to be checks and balances in the power of government. Right. And so we can disagree, or I think politically people disagree, but the reality of it is jobs are going to have to come from private sector activity because it's focused on some degree of profit and efficiency and paying taxes. So if we agree on that, then we have to say you need to have some boundaries on government debt. I think that's been lost in recent years. So it's troubling because the advanced economies have such huge debts. Who's going to pay for all that debt? And the developing countries look at that and say, where am I ever going to get enough capital to really start my own economy growing? So I think there should be a very clear consensus in the US that there needs to be a debt limit, but there should not be a default. I've proposed and advocate the idea of there being a newly written debt limit by the US that achieves that. You have to have restraint on spending, and it needs to be serious, chosen by our elected representatives and the administration, but what is the spending level? But you can't have default as one of the penalties. I've thought of it in terms of escalating penalties when you're above a debt to GDP ratio. So if we're at 120% now, I don't know what we're at today, 110%. If you say if you're above 115%, get prepared, because there's going to be consequences, escalating penalties, but not default. But anyway, the consequence, I really think it would be severe for the U.S. and for the world if they reached an impasse. So I hope they will work it out. I was pleased that the House passed a bill. So very importantly, they said, here's what we think can be done to raise the debt limit. That's the way it's supposed to be done. And then I'm pleased to see now the president entering negotiations. And so I'm hopeful they will work it out sooner. The cost kind of increase as you get closer and closer to the zero hour. Yeah. So I think it would be best for the world if they figure it out sooner rather than later.
Excellent. So I'm going to have to get this. If you've written your idea down, I would actually love to get that from
it was
you.
in both my Forbes. I used to do this regular Forbes column and
I'll find that.
Wall Street Journal, and I'm sorry. This is a really important issue for the world. That when they wrote the Constitution, they didn't put in a debt limit because they had no dream that they could borrow so much money. If they'd known, they would have put in a debt limit, and then. In the law that we're operating under now was written in 1917 in order to cause more spending, not less. It was during World War I, and the government wanted to find a way to authorize huge deficit spending. So I think we really have to examine that and say, look, the current law doesn't work. We hate this idea of every few years going into this crisis negotiation centered on Washington. President Reagan said all of this and said it eloquently in the 1980s. And so how many times do we want to do this?
We're over 90, so I guess that's... So this is the first audience question. Okay. I was handed this actually in the hallway before we began. So. And they wrote it, my son Jason, who's with me this evening, will graduate from high school tomorrow and go to study in the STEM field. What one piece of advice would you offer him that would be meaningful for the years to come?
Well, one piece.
Well, if you want to give him two, that's allowed.
Academia sometimes runs the risk of doing deep dives and getting people very small. So try to be broad and try to communicate on a broad range of topics. Whatever kind of engineering you're doing or computer science or whatever, be able to communicate it because in the end, that should be gold. Don't get too buried in the weeds.
Excellent. So we have some interesting questions. So with the increase in global competition, rising inequality, and the impact of innovation on the labor market, how's the World Bank working to ensure that the benefits of technical advancement and globalization are distributed equitably? How do you see the role of the World Bank evolving in this context? Phase one, phase two. Thanks, Doug.
That's a complicated question. One thing I will say, there is I alluded to it a little bit in the COVID answer and the question was loaded there with the idea of fairness. As you think about it, growth is the critical element, and you want to have growth in lots of countries. So the temptation is going to be, and I heard it this weekend in Hiroshima, that the rich countries should give their technology to the poor countries because then they could make sophisticated things. And literally that is said. But that doesn't end up working to actually get the job done. So I think we have to have some kind of core that that market-based systems are part of the future. They've done better than non-market systems. So then to that question, that means there needs to be sharing of information around the world through student exchanges, through professors doing exchanges, through people being aware of what's going on, through transparency, all of the elements that I was going through. And the World Bank is in the middle of all that. We just launched, and I'll advertise it, we've been at it for a while. We do education, a lot of education programs in Africa. They hadn't been well enough connected into the US, and so we've entered an exchange between the historically black colleges and universities and with African universities. And it's more robust than you might think, because the historically black colleges, HBCUs, are strong in STEM, they're strong in medical, and I know Rice University is strong in all of these, and they should have exchanges in Africa. But having the students cross back and forth is great, and then having the professors do that. So I was in Togo in February or March, in French West Africa, and at the University of Lomé, which has 70,000 students, we had Clark Atlanta University, which is a STEM kind of school in Atlanta, meet with University of Lomé and exchange knowledge on the poultry industry. Well, you'd say, okay, how long do we want that to go? You could do the poultry industry for hours, because it's so important to people around the world. And so they are exchanging information on how to test eggs, how to transport product, and so on down. And I think a lot more of that needs to be done, and the World Bank's doing that.
So at the end of the day, it's really more about education and human capital than physical capital. That's how I would view it. Like equality and countries, poorer countries becoming richer countries, is about becoming more educated.
Human capital, and I don't want to underestimate, they need roads, they need schools, physical things. Yeah. And so that all needs to happen, but I took the question. That was a long, involved question. Yeah. But how do you force exchanges? And I'm saying you need to invite exchanges.
Can you please explain how the World Bank plans to support the creation of a carbon market? So,
we have a knowledgeable.
Yes.
We do. But this goes deep into what I was saying of as the world thinks about what the verifiable results are. So I have a strong view on how this can be done, and the World Bank is trying to do this. I think there are economists who say the perfect way to do this is to create a sophisticated carbon credit trading system worldwide. Okay, so let's say that's your goal. How do you get from here to there? And the people have been trying to do this for 20 years without really very much success, because you need standards that are common and you need verification of results. I think you have to do it with a bespoke contract. So you need to do it 10 times at least to show that you have a system. And there haven't been really 10 verification processes. And so over and over again, having a contract that achieves what you're trying to do, and then allow that to become a market. So think about the mortgage market in the US. In order to have a big trading system, you needed to have some standardization of the language within the mortgage contracts. Before you did that, you had to have quite a few mortgages that were outstanding. So the world's still building that whole concept. I get a little frustrated with people with the idea that you should just create a carbon market from scratch. Tomorrow I'd like to have a carbon market. Well, okay, fine, but it's happening step by step. So the World Bank is working on a carbon credit market by working to have standards for various products. We published our Paris alignment papers and standards. Others have not published them. We've invited global comment on the Paris alignment concepts of the World Bank, and then through that process, that can help standardize this effort. I think in the end, and this actually was talked about in Hiroshima, as you try to enforce a market, there has to be, you do that either through taxation or through mandates, and those are still sticking points. Around the world, people want to say, oh, I want to have a carbon market, but not require it or create a tax system. The U.S. had one success, all of these are important topics, with sulfur dioxide. Remember acid rain? Acid rain. And so there was a recognition that this was harmful. It was causing pitting in cars, in the Rust Belt and other things. So in order to create that, Congress debated and set standards, and then had a requirement of reduction of sulfur dioxide, and it was done through a trading system, and that one functioned. But the thought process has to be pretty engaged, and I don't think the world's at that point yet.
Yeah, that was the 1991 Clean Air and Water Act. That's probably
very
one
good.
of the most successful.
We have lots of knowledge being shared here today.
If you had a crystal ball, so let's go back to your forecasting days when you're at Bear Stearns or running your own company. If you had a crystal ball, how do you foresee world economic powers playing out in the next 10 years? China, BRIC, et cetera. I guess I'm going to add to this question and say, what about just an easier question than 10 years out? In 2 years, will we be down to 2% inflation?
Decisions made day by day are important. So as far as inflation, it's really important how much production do you think is going to be done, because that's what pulls prices down. China finally undid their lockdown in December. I was one of the first in after they relieved their quarantine. And so they're a major world producer. The U.S. could do more, I think, in the way of increasing production in order to pull inflation down. I think the Federal Reserve also could recognize that they not only control consumption, which they talk about, but they also have a big impact on supply. So one of the things I've wanted is the U.S. to set a direction where they plan to have the central bank shrink the size of its balance sheet, because you know how the central bank works. They borrow overnight, every night, from the private sector in order to buy bonds. And the Fed is holding right now $9 trillion.
So they borrow $9 trillion
So they
every
borrow.
night?
They have some currency outstanding,
Yeah.
$2 trillion. So they don't have to borrow that every night. People hold it in their wallet a little bit, but almost all the rest is borrowed overnight through the reverse repo market and through the bank reserves that they pay interest on, and so that takes it away from the capital available, and so I think more can be done on the production side. But, I wanted to say I think it's very important the decisions people make on currencies, because that then gives you the stability to move forward. Notable for China's success is that they openly declared that they want a strong and stable yuan, and so. That has been the linchpin, really, of their growth policies since 1993, and so that is an issue in, if you think about the variables in the global outlook. You mentioned the BRIC Bank is Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa is also part of that. It's troubling to see the countries kind of make their approach to Russia or to China. But I think the best, strongest response by the U.S. is to redouble our strength. And then people will come visit the U.S., and seek support of the U.S. from a position of strength. Reagan was loud and, as I mentioned, peace through strength. And I think that's a very strong point. So I think it's early to make a forecast out 10 years. One thing we know is that China's soft power, that means not the military side, but the rest of their side is gaining strength. They're using a lot of the lessons, techniques from the legal systems in the U.S. and the U.K. And incorporating that into their strategy. For example, antitrust law, they've adopted it, but then they're using it in order to force companies to pay attention to China. They do that in international organizations by negotiating 24/7 on every issue. And so that gives them increasing soft power within the world. That can be, the U.S. can strongly respond to that by having a stronger vision within international organizations. I didn't say money, I said vision, meaning what are we trying to accomplish and how hard do we work at it to get the people going in that direction. You can do it by from the U.S. side having just a stronger economic platform. Our growth, U.S. growth, is slowing down toward, I don't know this year, but maybe 1% or on the slow side. And that is not strong enough to really move the world forward. One problem with slow growth, and I'm worried about global growth falling to 2% and below, creates a crisis for development, which is bad. But it also means there's not enough money being made to reinvest. If you fall down to a certain level, you don't get the growth out into the future. And that seems to, there's a little of that going on, with the worry that growth will stay slow. Now we're in Texas, so it's Texas is doing is marching to its own drummer, but many parts of the world are growing too slowly.
Too slowly. With that, we are 2 minutes past 7 o'clock. So I would like to take the opportunity just to thank you. It's been a real honor. We really appreciate you coming. We think it's a great way to end your World Bank tenure here at the Baker Institute, given your connections with Secretary Baker. And we're just really appreciative that you chose to come and speak to us tonight. I want to thank the wonderful audience. Thank y'all for coming. We really appreciate your support. And we'll see you in the fall.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
Thank you.